We had the Minnesota study of twins reared apart with Jacob Lehnen, Casey Jacobson, Taylor Maier, and David Kocisko. Now before we begin, we're going to go over a couple of terms. I mean, most people probably already remember this from high school biology, but fraternal or dizygotic twins are the twins that happen when two separate eggs are fertilized during pregnancy. Identical or monozygotic occur when one single zygote splits into two. And then phenotype is what is present and visual. You can observe this, while genotypes are the four types of the alleles that are in the genetic coding. And this study is going to use a few abbreviations. MZA, monozygotic apart. DZA is dizygotic apart. MZT is monozygotic together. And DZT is dizygotic together. Here's a diagram here of the twin process of the two different types. Now, the question our study came to ask was nature versus nurture, and basically which one of those is more important in development. Now, it's kind of difficult to measure this, but the objectives of the study were to determine, what can you determine which is inherited or genetic, and there's some qualitative and quantitative results. They didn't just try to say which is it, because obviously both are very important influences on nearly everything in development. So they went to get some numerical results as to which contributes what percent. Now, some people in the class might wonder, why should they care? And that's an important question to ask. I mean, it helps us to understand the environment and genetic, and there's a lot of support you could do. You could help improve and nurture certain positive attributes. You could encourage good, positive qualities, while also we can gain insight into inherited traits and which ones are acquired. This knowledge can help us understand quite a bit about the human mind, which is basically what psychology is. So, some of the applications of this are in personality traits and intelligence. According to, whoa, what just happened? Alright, and we're back online here. So, according to Bochard, 40 to 50% of these matters below are all genetically related. So there's a genetic link to the likelihood of divorce, eating disorders, and lifespan. They're all kind of observed by the later Minnesota twin study. However, falling in love is not genetic, for those of you wondering. Now, the researchers kind of mentioned the issue of human cloning, mainly because it's a controversial one and always in discussions. Now, it's not really considered unnatural by the twins. They questioned about it, but the ethics underlying it are very important, and it really only touched base on this for a brief period in the report. What were the predictions in the study? They didn't give us quite a bit of information about it, but they kind of spoke of the environmental bias and how, as humans, we like to believe that we are kind of products of our environment. Now, why is that? Well, behaviorism was a very popular subgroup of psychology, and it was supporting this theory. And biological and genetic influences aren't very obvious to see. You can't really say, I am this way because I saw this in my genes. I mean, to the lay person, they're not going to know any of this, so it's kind of difficult to observe unless you're a biological scientist. And also, people like to think they're in control, to say that I have a certain trait because it was encoded in my DNA, isn't as, comforting as it is to think I am this way because I chose to be, or because my parents raised me this way. What were their expectations and observed conclusions? Well, here's a quote from the study. For almost every behavioral trait so far investigated, from reaction time to religiosity, an important fraction of the variation among people turns out to be associated with genetic variation. This fact need no longer be subject to debate. Rather, it is time to consider its implications.
Okay, so I'm Taylor, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the method that they use to study this. As you said, it's a correlational study. It can't be an experiment because it wouldn't be ethical to control all the other variables on kids being raised and taking some kids apart when the parents obviously don't want them to be taken apart. So it's a correlational study. There's a lot of other factors that could be influencing the results. It's cross-sectional, multiple Ages were used and studied way from 19 all the way up to senior citizen, 68 years old. And different times that they've been apart were used too. Some of them had recently been separated, and some of them have been separated forever, but they'd all been reunited at some point in the past. So the participants, they used 56 sets of monozygotic or identical twins, and then they used 30 sets of the dizygotic twins, the fraternal twins. They'd all been separated shortly after birth, as I said, and raised apart, and they were from all over the world. And basically what they did was they got all these people by word of mouth. They just started announcing that they were going to start doing this study, and one set of twins, well then we'd heard about this other set of twins and families and stuff. Hey, I'm married to a guy and he was separated at birth and he doesn't know it. And they did a lot of helping people find their twins that they've been separated from. So there's a lot of that going on. As I said, the age was from 19 to 68, young to old, all adults obviously. Middle age, average age about 41. First, of course, they had to make sure that they were actually twins that were separated. So they did DNA tests to confirm that they were all twins. And then, so they studied all these different traits, and we're going to get to that in a second, through 50 hours of medical and psychological assessments, all in 1 week. So they had busy weeks, these twins, when they were there. So our dependent variables, there's a lot of different variables in here, so I try to pick out the main important ones. Personality, how's their personality compared to each other? Occupational interest, what do they do, what do they want to do? Mental ability, big one, goes right along with intelligence. What are they capable of doing? Is that reflected by their linked to genetics, or is it different because of how they were raised? Are they more intelligent? Psychiatric state, does psychiatric problems have a link genetically, stuff like that. And then sexual activity, and also sexual preference was studied. Independent variables, they basically compared them on two different planes, whether or not they were reared together apart, comparing those twins that had been separated at birth and twins that hadn't. And then they also compared identical and fraternal to see if there's a difference there. How do they do this? As I said, when they were studying all these things, they used multiple backups, so they weren't depending on one test. 4 personality trait inventories, 3 occupational interests, 2 mental ability batteries, systematic assessment of rearing conditions to make sure poor conditions, some sort of damage hadn't been done to them psychologically, 3 IQ tests. They did a life history interview, a psychiatric interview, a sexual history interview, and they independently filled out questionnaires. All this was done by separate examiners, so there's no bias and no one was leaning towards, I know what the other one said, so maybe they influence it that way.
Alright, so the results of this study, basically it shows that there was little to no difference in twins raised apart versus together, which is basically, it's correlational evidence, not causation, so it can't be proven, and it's because it's not an experiment. So they measured this through the tests, like Taylor said, and they also used, they to make it more familiar, they used R values. So the R value that was closest to 1 meant there was a high correlation, and the R value that was closest to 0 meant that there was little to no correlation. And the lowest value was 0.7, which still suggests that there's a correlation between the tests. So this is the figure from the article. And as you can see, these yellow boxes show the R values, and all of them are pretty close to 1, so it means there's a high correlation between those tests. Okay, so the researchers' original prediction that the environment played a major role had been wrong. The environment does play a role, but not as crucial as they once thought. So that meant that genetics actually plays a much bigger role, which they didn't think that was going to be the case. But there's also some critics that argue that the findings are not valid because of it's a equal environment assumption, meaning that they said that the twins, even though they were raised apart, were raised in a equal environment, so the differences were not that much the same, meaning that those results should be basically thrown out because they're not that different environments. Okay, so later research basically said another study from the University of Minnesota indicates that there was considerable evidence that genes play a bigger role in development than first realized. And remember that all of these studies are still correlational, not causation.
Alright, so this was a landmark study for a couple of different reasons. Like Jake just mentioned, it was a study that helped to show that genetics played a lot larger role than previously thought. Obviously there's still an impact from the environment, but it showed that genetics does play a pretty big role in development. One of the key things that came out of this was that there was evidence that being reared in the same house as far as being reared apart, so whether or not they were fraternal or identical twins, it was a little bit more negligible for a lot of psychological traits. It challenged the origins of individuality and differences in people's personalities and things like that. It was a landmark study because it was a large collection of evidence with all 100 sets of twins, or a little bit over 100 sets of twins that participated in the study. And it had a lot to do with IQ variance relating to genetic variation, which was something that was really interesting. Some of the limitations, it was hard to find participants, obviously, because they couldn't have a lot of control. They had to rely more on word of mouth and people volunteering to come in. So you can't get people from a huge cross section of like lifestyles and things like that all the time. And I think what ended up happening, they got a lot of people from more of like the middle class area, so a lot of the results fit more in that instead of, because they only had a few people from really impoverished conditions, so they can't really extrapolate the findings to those areas or even to the upper echelon, like the high class lifestyle either. Again, as we mentioned before, you can't really do an experiment on this where you can control those factors because it's not ethical to do those things to human beings, and therefore the findings can't be proven. It's just things that we could explore further if any other methods came about where we could try to get closer to proving it. Relevance for today, it's obviously important genetically, but at the same time it doesn't take away from the impact that your environment can have, the importance of education, parenting, all those things that are still going to influence your development. It helps to contribute to the rapid change of pace of the culture, and how people differ genetically can help describe how they differ with their personalities and things like that. And it also helps to determine the most effective environment to raise a child in because of the genetics they have. And a lot of times their genetics kind of showed what environment is the best for them because they'll have certain personality traits with the difference in genetics. Questions? You.